If you think of some of the most misunderstood mental illnesses in the general media and modern society, you may think of illnesses like schizophrenia, PTSD, bipolar, or maybe even borderline personality disorder. However, I personally think that the correct answer would be dissociative identity disorder, also known as DID. DID is an illness that has been completely shrouded in mystery for most of its lifetime, finally being classified as a real mental illness in the late 20th century by the American Psychiatric Association in the third issue of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as DSM-3. DID has had an insane history in just the last 50 years, from being linked to Satanism in the 70s to eventually becoming a viral trend in the early 2020s. DID definitely has one of the most interesting and chaotic mental disorder stories in American history. How did this happen? How does DID actually work? What causes it? And why is it still disputed today? Well, in this video, I'm going to go through all of that and more. As someone who has spent many years obsessing over this niche and relatively unknown disorder, and countless hours researching the history, causes, and symptoms, I think that I am relatively qualified to speak on the subject. So, sit down with me, grab a snack, a clipboard with a pen, and your own comically large shrink glasses, and let's jump right into the history. Well, actually, before we go face first in the history of DID, we should probably go through the basics just for some context. Dissociative identity disorder is a mental and physical disorder that basically splits the brain into several parts. We will dive into the causes of this later, but for now, we only need to know how it works. The different sectors of the brain are called alters. Each alter usually has an entirely different personality, name, and sometimes even accent. However, the amount, types, and differences between alters do vary greatly depending on the person. Each alter branches off from the core, which is basically the original person. People usually start showing signs of DID between the ages of 5 and 10, which leaves several years worth of time for the core to develop as their own. So, with the basics out of the way, let's actually get into the history. The first ever documented case of DID was a woman named Jeanne Ferry in 1584. She documented her own exorcism in a novel called La Possession that was finally published in France in 1886. At the time of La Possession being published, DID was only known as split mind. The leading theory at the time was that Ferry was being possessed or manipulated by angels and or demons for whatever reason. From the accounts of the exorcists that treated her, Ferry was described as having multiple personalities, which we now know as alters. As far as we're aware, Ferry showed signs of at least 6 separate alters. Each alter is described to have taken the identity of a different biblical figure, further leading to the possession theory. Each alter had its own little quirk that it, specialized in. One hurt itself, one starved itself, another one was also hell-bent on doing the same, one would regress into a childlike state, and one was even focused on helping Ferry through the healing/exorcism process. At the time, no one really knew what caused it, but from phrase journaling, we can come to the conclusion that her father hurt and even possibly sexually abused her, which explains why she developed the idea in the first place. I spent a lot of time researching Jeanne Ferry and her story, but I couldn't find a definitive fate for Ferry or even what became of her after the whole exorcism/treatment thing was over. Even though Ferry's story is 4.5 centuries old now, her story matches perfectly with what we now know are the signs of DID. Although the whole possession thing is probably not correct, Ferry and La Possession laid the groundwork for what is now the modern definition of DID. There were several more alleged cases of DID over the next several centuries. One such case was a woman named Sister Bernadette in 1623. She was allegedly being possessed by 3 boy angels who would take over her body and hurt her to cause pain. As with Jeanne Ferry, each personality had its own way of speaking, and they would also starve themselves. Bernadette also suffered from intense amnesia and memory loss, which Ferry also had, but I'm mentioning it here because it was more severe for Bernadette. She also had a somewhat tumultuous childhood, like Ferry. Both of Bernadette's parents were supposedly possessed, and her father died when she was only 9. Bernadette's story is quite a bit less known, and as a result, less thorough than fairies, but still gives us another good look at centuries-old cases of this relatively new disorder. Skipping ahead several entire centuries, we reach the first ever real diagnosis of DID in France of 1882, Louis Auguste Vivet. Vivet showed signs of DID from a relatively young age. He was physically abused as a little boy and also was prone to having violent outbursts. What set his case of DID into motion, in the eyes of the doctors at least, was a snake bite that Vivet suffered at the age of 17, which resulted in the loss of use in his legs for about a year. After an incredibly long, violent outburst, he regained the use of his legs, but forgot almost everything from the entire month before. Over the course of several years, he would go from being insanely violent and mean, then have an outburst, and then become calm and gentle. These major personality switches were determined to be different alters. However, due to DID still only being known as double personality disorder at the time, the public was only aware of two of Vivet's supposed three personalities, so that his diagnosis fit more into the mold of DPD. Also, at this point, most people stopped believing in possession, so cases of DID were labeled as extreme hysteria instead, which I guess is a step forward. Now, we are entering more modern times, to where DID was first introduced to the masses. Even though there were about 100 alleged cases of DID between Jean Ferry and Vivet, outside of France, no one knew what the hell it was, or that it was even a thing in the first place. That was until 1973, when American journalist and author Flora Reda Schreiber published a book called Sybil. This book became an insane cultural phenomenon, even becoming a limited-time TV film twice, once in 1976 and again in 2007. As a little experiment, I asked about 8 adults that I know who were born sometime in the 60s and 70s if they know what Sybil is, and all 8 of them said, "Oh, that's that movie about the crazy person that was around when I was little." But what exactly was Sybil, and why was it such a hit in the West? Well, I'm glad you asked, because if you, like me, have never heard of the story of and around the book before, you're in for one hell of a treat. Sybil is an alleged true story of a woman with immense childhood trauma named Sybil Dorset. Her real name was Shirley Mason, but the name Sybil was used to protect her identity at the time. Due to her significant trauma, Sybil develops dissociative identity disorder, and is sort of portrayed as going mad. The main part of the story is focused on Sybil and her doctor, Cornelia Wilbur, as Dr. Wilbur tries to find out what is going on with Sybil, and also tries to convince Sybil and convey to her that she has DID. Sybil, in this case, is split into 16 personalities. Some are young, some are old, and some are very sporadic and prone to outbursts and episodes. So after Dr. Wilbur's experience with Sybil, and having dealt with a disorder that only had 100 alleged cases at the time, instead of writing an extensive scientific paper on her findings in time with Sybil, she instead approached her author friend, Flora Schreiber, to turn the story into a published book. And then, practically overnight, it seemed like everybody had, or at least read, a copy of Sybil. The book sold 6 million copies and took the world by storm. Then, just 3 years later, the 1996 over 3-hour TV film was released and once again swept the world with talks of Sybil. The whole world was completely enamored with Mason's story. By not talking about the story of Sybil specifically, I'm going to refer to the person Sybil as Mason just for clarity's sake. Sybil, both the book and TV film, caused a mass DID hysteria in the United States. This hysteria led to an insane uptick of cases during the 1970s to the 2000s. 4 years after the film, in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published DSM-3, which is basically a book full of mental disorders that the American health system considers to be real. DSM-3 includes dissociative identity disorder, which means that finally, after centuries of either being considered just plain hysteria and even thought to be full-on possession by biblical beings/creatures, the dissociative identity disorder that we know today was established as a true mental disorder. However, the story of Sybil is not over yet. The book was met with just as much skepticism as it was praise. Many people did not believe the story for a second and accused both Wilbur and Schreiber of starting a viral hoax just for the hell of it. These allegations didn't really stick though. That was until 2011, when the book Sybil Exposed was written and released by a primarily feminist author named Debbie Nathan. Sybil Exposed sought to shine a new light on the story of Sybil and the people involved. The book explained how Dr. Wilbur's techniques in treating Mason's condition were very manipulative and outright strange. Dr. Wilbur did most of Mason's treatment using hypnosis and drugs, leading to Mason giving what are most likely untrue answers. These practices were leaked in several tapes recording Dr. Wilbur's sessions with Mason.
Now you look at me and you begin to get sleepy. 1, 2, 3, and you may go to sleep. Something happened last night at 10 minutes after 10. What happened?
She dialed
Who is she?
that other girl.
What's her name? You know it?
I don't know her name.
Yes, dear, you do.
No, doctor, I don't know her name. I don't see her very many times.
And what did she say?
She talked to me.
And what did she talk about?
I feel sick.
It's all right, sweetie. What's your name?
I'm Shirley.
Mm-hmm. She said her name was Shirley. How old are you?
11.
Mm-hmm. So there are two Shirleys, the 11-year-old Shirley and the grown-up Shirley. Right? What stopped you from growing up, sweetie? Sweetie?
As you may be able to tell, it sort of feels like she isn't in the right headspace to be giving the most accurate answers, you know? But I'm not here to discuss the validity of Sybil, just the story around it. Even after Sybil Exposed release, the original Sybil book is one of the most important psychological and psychiatric books ever written in American history. Sybil will go down in history as a book that finally brought DIDs into the eyes of the public. Whether the story was completely true or fabricated purposely or accidentally doesn't matter. Wow, that was an incredibly long segment. However, I thought that the history of DID was very important to work through so that we can understand how all of that has turned into our modern definition of DID today. So, finally, we're going to actually discuss how DID works, what causes it, what are the symptoms, and then finally talk about how the hell DID sprung back up into the mainstream media all these years later. So let's finally get cracking on talking about. As we've discussed already, DID splits the brain, metaphorically, of course, into different sectors, each having their own personalities, memories, backstories, and more. From what we understand about DID, the main purpose that it serves is to protect the brain from its own memories. When someone has memories of extremely traumatic events, whether it be physical and/or emotional trauma, the brain tries to protect itself from remembering and digging up these bad memories. Usually, this becomes coping mechanisms, good and bad, but in some extreme cases, the brain's coping mechanism is to separate the physical memories into a different, new portion of the brain. These new segments of the brain is what we call alters. These alters have their own basically made up lives, personalities, cultures, and literally every single thing that makes up a person, besides the physical body. The act of splitting the brain usually ends with the core, who is the original personality, not remembering the memories that are being withheld from it, or at least it can no longer be remembered in graphic detail. So, you may now be wondering, what does DID really do? Well, I'm glad you asked. When a particular personality takes control from a different personality who is already driving the truck known as the body, something takes place called identity switching, usually regarded as just switching. When this happens, the brain usually loses control of the body for a moment while the switching occurs, and then blam, new person. Depending on the person's amount of awareness of the fact that they actually have DID, switching can either be voluntarily or involuntarily. If a person isn't aware of their DID, usually have no idea what is going on and what happened. Because when one personality is in control, none of the others are. Once a person is aware of their DID, the amount of confusion can be mitigated through very careful planning or even finding ways to communicate with the other personalities through notes or something of the sort. A major part of DID are the specific roles that each alter plays to the overall brain system. There are quite a few, so we'll start with the easiest one to understand, the core. The core is the original personality that basically started it all. The core also usually stays relatively the same and maintains the same life and memories they had before, besides the traumatic memories, which are remembered by a role called the protector. The protector defends the rest of the body and brain from threats, whether that be physically or emotionally, depends on the situation. If the current host of the body gets in a fight, the protector is usually the one to come out and throw hands. If the host is facing traumatic memories or flashbacks, the protector is the one to come out and throw metaphorical hands. The protector is one of the most vital parts of the DID system, basically the glue. Some systems also have alters that are called either littles or middles. Littles are basically little kids trapped in a far bigger body. They talk like kids, run around like kids, and lose their minds like kids. Middles are more of your preteen teenager personalities. They are basically the teen version of littles and vice versa. There are so many alter roles like introjects, memory holders, gatekeepers, self-helpers, fragments, caretakers, and fictives. I can't cover them all, but there are 2 sources linked into the description that go in depth into each role and what they do. However, I did leave out one last role that I do want to talk about, the prosecutor. The prosecutor is basically dead set on giving the host a bad day. As an act of trying to help the system, prosecutors cause it more pain, usually to try and make it so if something bad happens, it doesn't feel as bad in comparison. The prosecutor might sound like a very bad thing to have as a part of your life, and it kind of is, but the alter usually always has the best of intentions, but doesn't go about it the best ways.
I am in a sweater now. It got really freaking cold. Another important fact about alters and their roles is that the amount of alters and roles that are present in a system differ wildly between each one. Some systems may only have 4 alters, each with their own roles, while other systems can have a practically infinite number of alters that repeat roles. DID is a very controversial topic, as we've already talked about, and I'm going to talk more about soon. And one of the major reasons is because each person has their own wildly different experience with it, making it basically impossible to actually set the real facts about DID into stone. So, now that we've discussed what DID is and how it works, let's talk about one of the less controversial and unknown aspects of DID. The most common and well-known cause of DID is excessive childhood trauma. Whether this be physical, verbal, mental, emotional, or sexual abuse, and everything in between, an immense amount of it can severely mess with the brain. A lot of the abuse that can cause DID takes place around the ages of 4 to 10. If it sounds like the DID may be a really common thing to have because of how many people have childhood trauma, in your mind, come up with what you think is the amount of abuse that can possibly cause DID, and then multiply that about 5 times. That would be a closer measurement. The most apparent symptom is abrupt memory loss. The feeling of going unconscious and popping up somewhere entirely different at an entirely different time over and over again is very common for people with DID. Actually, because of this reason, a lot of people believe that they are possessed when they first start experiencing symptoms. Many people with DID also have severe depression or suicidal thoughts before and sometimes after being diagnosed. They also tend to hear voices very often, which leads even more into the possessed theory. Some doctors will diagnose a lot of people with DID as being either schizophrenic or just a heretic, making it difficult for people suffering with DID to get the help and resources that they really need. So now that we've spent some time talking about how DID really works and happens, let's loop all the way back to DID's public perception, especially in the media. So, let's chat about DID. DID spent almost all of its life in obscurity until Sybil, but even that turned out to be just a fad. Almost as quick as it came, DID was mostly phased out of the public consciousness. Had a slight comeback when the second Sybil film was released in 2007, but that didn't last long. There were a few films that involved DID, but none were able to catch the lightning in a bottle that Sybil was, also they weren't very good. So fast forward quite a bit to the year that everything went wrong. The cause of the extreme growth of DID in the mainstream media during the COVID days is almost entirely unknown. The amount of people claiming to have DID on social media, mostly TikTok, grew exponentially during this time. And yet, the world's fascination with DID was back. Because of TikTok only being super popular for younger people at the time, that changed a few years later, and now even senior citizens are watching and making TikToks.
Ice and milk and you're weird, but add coffee and it's normal.
Many people from the older generation still really only remember DID as that thingy from Sybil. But to most people who consumed an unhealthy amount of TikTok during that time, admit it, it was most of us, it sort of seemed like everyone was self-diagnosing themselves with DID. This wasn't helped by a video from very well-known YouTuber Anthony Padilla, now named Smosh alike, called I Spent a Day with Multiple Personalities, Dissociative Identity Disorder, that, as of December 2025, has gained an insane 23 million views. This introduced his fanbase of over 7.5 million subscribers to DID and made so many more people become interested in DID. Funnily enough, I was one of the subscribers that was introduced to DID from his video. I never knew about it beforehand and just clicked the video out of curiosity at 3 in the morning when I was still a dumb kid and thought that pulling an all-nighter 3 times a week was good for my physical and mental health. Anywho, now even more people online were self-diagnosing in 2021. Now even more people online were self-diagnosing. In 2021, Netflix released a documentary called The 24 Faces of Billy Milligan, about a true story of a very bad guy in 1977 who blamed his very horrific crimes on him having DID. The validity of his claims are still disputed, but this documentary was yet another cause for DID entering the media once again. However, the documentary was pretty bad. But, just like Sybil, all of this turned out to be a bit of a fad, and most of the interest in DID faded once again, just like everything on the internet does. A lot of the TikTok accounts that claimed to have DID either faded out of popularity or disappeared entirely, and that was DID's last surge in popularity as of late 2025. Will it come back again? Yeah, probably. DID is a fascinating disorder that is still relatively unfigured out yet. In the world that we live in that is so full of science, and where it feels like we kind of know everything that can be known about the brain, having this phenomenon in the scientific field is of course going to pique people's interests. Speaking of DID not being fully deconstructed yet, we now have to talk about, by far, the most disputed part of DID. Is it even real? I'm going to try my very best not to insert my own personal opinion here on if I think DID is real or not. However, I'm sure that you could probably figure my opinion out pretty easily just by watching the video, but I would like you, the viewer, to come to your own conclusion if you would like. Many people think that DID is either completely made up for attention's sake, for trying to cope, or for purely malicious reasons, as in the Billy Milligan case. Some people think that DID is just something that comes about from being a so-called heretic and manifesting it in their minds. Some people think that it's just a different word for schizophrenia. However, the United States does realize DID as a real and diagnosable mental disorder and has for many years. However, just like everything else with DID, the question of whether it should be officially realized has been disputed and argued by psychologists, scientists, and your local Joe Schmoes alike. So, if you want to learn more about DID and come to an even more educated conclusion about it, there are a lot of sources that you can use to learn more. Every single source that I personally use for this video, and also a few just purely interesting and educational videos that I found, are all linked in the description of this video. So please, do your own more in-depth research if this video piques your interest, just like Anthony Padilla's video did for me over 5 years ago. That video is also linked in the description. So, that's it. You are now a more educated member of society because you know about a niche mental disorder. It has been very nice to yap about my 5-year-long hyperfixation for the last 20-ish minutes. DID, fully real or not, is a fascinating psychological phenomenon that will continue to be studied for years to come. I, personally, can't wait to see what comes of more research in the near future. So, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little deep dive, and if you did, please like and subscribe, and maybe I'll make another video just like this. But this was a lot of work, and I need a nap. So, anyways, thanks for stopping by, and have a good one. Thank you for watching.